Christian Heroes Then and Now. Eric Liddell, Something Greater Than Gold, by Janet and Geoff Benge. Chapter 14. Enemies. The Seochong to which Eric returned at the end of October 1940 was not the same place he had left a year before. A high wall now surrounded the entire town, which was patrolled day and night by guards. The Japanese had decided to occupy Seochong and turn it into a garrison town and command center for road building in the area. Until that time, the roads that linked the villages on the Great Plain were narrow, winding, and unpaved. They wound carefully around gardens and ancient cemeteries. Cemeteries were very important to the Chinese people of the Great Plain. The people carefully tended and protected them. That is, until the Japanese decided that straight, paved roads across the plain would help them get their troops provisions from one place to another faster. Such new roads would be wide enough and flat enough for motor vehicles instead of the customary carts and mules. Motor vehicles and tanks, the Japanese hoped, would help them win the war. All able-bodied men, women, and children in Seochong were forced to help build the new roads. They shoveled dirt and moved huge rocks by hand. The work was both backbreaking and heartbreaking. While the Japanese guards played cards and told each other jokes, the Chinese forced laborers were made to hack roads through the most sacred thing in their lives, their ancestors' graves. Eric felt sick when he heard what the Japanese had done. He was glad he had come back. The Chinese people now more than ever needed some good news. Somehow, they had to find meaning in their lives in the midst of such cruelty and hatred. Eric knew that the truth of the gospel message could give them that meaning. Some things did go on as normal, though. Couples were married, babies were born, and funeral services were held. Soon after he had returned, Eric was invited to a nearby village to attend the wedding of a couple he knew well. The ceremony went fine, and the wedding party paid no attention to the blast of heavy artillery less than a mile away. In the joy of the wedding, the outside world was ignored for a few hours. Eric had planned to return to Seochong later that night after the wedding. However, when he heard that the Communist Army was out in force, he decided to spend the night. The next morning, he set out for home on his bicycle. A friend who had attended the wedding rode with him. They were about halfway to Seochong when Eric heard the ping of bullets around him. Immediately, he slammed on his brakes and yelled for his friend to do the same. Both men jumped off their bicycles, and as they did so, more bullets whizzed around them. Then, suddenly the hail of bullets abruptly stopped. Eric and his friend heard a rustle in the bushes at the side of the road, and several Chinese men sheepishly crawled out of the undergrowth. They immediately began apologizing to Eric and his friend. Apparently, they had mistaken the two of them on their bicycles for members of the Japanese army. As Eric and his friend leapt from their bikes, the Chinese men were able to get a good look at them, realized their mistake, and stopped firing. After they had apologized, Eric and his friend rode on. As they rode, Eric thought about what had happened. No one was safe anymore. Something as simple as riding back from a wedding could get a person killed. Eric was just glad the Chinese men had been such poor shots. Eric wrote often to Flo in Tynson. In his letters, he tried to explain to her how things had changed in Seochong and how important he felt his missionary work was. I now go to the southwest, to a part I never visited before. When I am out, it is giving, giving, giving all the time, and trying to get to know the people, and trying to leave them a message of encouragement and peace in a time when there is no external peace at all, he wrote in one letter to Flo. The closer the Japanese forces got to completing their roads, the worse their behavior got. Officers no longer seemed to care about keeping their troops in order. Drunken soldiers would lurch into the hospital looking for patients or nurses to harass, their long swords gleaming menacingly at their sides. Many villages around Siochong were bombed to the ground, and a constant stream of injured and dying people entered the hospital. So many people needed medical help that Eric was pressed into service in the hospital as a nursing assistant. He learned to boil surgical instruments to sterilize them and to change dressings like an expert. He enjoyed his work in the hospital. It gave him time to share his faith with the patients. But there were dangers too. One day, Annie Buchan, hospital matron, walked into the operating theater looking for a doctor. She found him pinned against a wall with a Japanese soldier beating him over the head with a baton. Annie sprang forward without thinking. "I want this doctor," she demanded loudly. Startled to be spoken to in such a way by a short white woman, the soldier stepped back and then stormed out of the room. Annie tended to the doctor's wounds. Although the situation ended happily, the hospital staff, including Eric, began to wonder about their long-term safety as the situation around them continued to worsen. Finally, 5 months after Eric returned to Siochong, the Japanese ordered all foreigners out of the area. The hospital that had treated anyone in need, including Japanese soldiers, had to be evacuated. The missionaries were given 2 weeks to get out and told they could take nothing with them. As the missionaries left, they handed the keys of the hospital over to the Japanese, wondering what would happen to the sick and wounded people of the district now that there was no one to take care of them. It was obvious that the Japanese would not open the building up as a hospital again. In fact, it was never used again. Several months later, the building was burned to the ground. The London Missionary Society staff from Siochong scattered. Some, like Eric's brother Robert and his family, took long overdue furloughs, while others went to work in different hospitals and clinics. Some, like Eric, went to Tientsin. Back in Tientsin, Eric had a long talk with Flo. It was obvious that the Japanese were becoming more hostile towards Europeans, and Eric did not feel that it was safe for Flo to stay in China any longer, especially now that she was expecting their third child. There were also rumors that the Japanese were considering ordering all foreigners into internment camps. Eric could not bear the thought of his wife giving birth under such conditions. At first, Flo was reluctant to leave, but in the end, she came to agree with Eric. It would be much safer for her and the girls back in Canada. When the war was finally over, she would return to China. Escorting Flo and his daughters to the ship that would take them to Canada was probably the most difficult thing Eric Liddell ever had to do in his life. 5-year-old Patricia skipped along beside him as they climbed the gangway to board the ship, and Heather gave him a big grin when he lifted her onto the top bunk in their cabin. Before Eric and Flo had time to say everything they wanted to say to each other, the ship's whistle sounded. It was the signal for all visitors to disembark so that the gangway could be lowered and the ship made ready to sail. Eric sat on the bottom bunk and pulled Patricia onto his knee. He looked into her big blue eyes, which were almost identical to his own. "Now, Tricia," he said, choking back tears, "I want you to look after Mummy and help her with Heather and the new baby." Patricia gave him a big hug. "Yes, Daddy, I'll take care of Mummy until you come back," she said bravely. Flo turned away so that the children would not see her tears. Hand in hand, the family finally walked back out onto deck, where Eric kissed his wife goodbye. He gave her one last hug and whispered in her ear, "Those who love God never meet for the last time." Flo nodded, and as she fought back her tears, she knew she had to be strong, both for Eric and for the children. After the ship had sailed, Eric returned to Tynson with a heavy heart. He was sure he had done the right thing sending his family away to safety, but it had been so difficult to say goodbye, not knowing exactly when he would see them again. Since he could not go back to Siochung, Eric stayed with a teacher from the Anglo-Chinese college. Once again, he was living in the French concession, where he had spent so many happy times with his parents and family when he had first returned to China. Eric did not return to teaching. The school year at the Anglo-Chinese college was already underway, and the school did not need any extra teachers. For the first time in a long while, Eric had nothing in particular to do, so he decided to pursue a dream he'd had for a long time. There was little written material available to instruct Chinese pastors in how to effectively lead their churches, and Eric wanted to write a simple manual that would provide such instruction. He began his Manual of Christian Discipleship and worked hard on it every day. He also spoke at many church services and meetings. Eric was still working on the manual in September when he received a telegram from Flo, who had given birth to a baby girl. Eric longed to see Flo and hold Maureen Liddell, his newest daughter, but he knew it was not yet the right time. Things were getting worse in China, and as a missionary, he had a vital message of hope and encouragement that needed to be shared with people during such a dark time. December 1941 was not a good month for foreigners in China. On December 7th, 350 Japanese aircraft bombed Pearl Harbor on the Hawaiian island of Oahu, where the American Pacific Fleet was anchored. 2 battleships were sunk and 6 others were severely damaged. Nearly 2,900 American soldiers and sailors were killed. The same day, the Japanese also attacked the Philippines and British-controlled Malaya and Hong Kong. The following day, December 8, 1941, the United States and Great Britain declared war on Japan. The world was shocked at the way Japan had launched such vicious attacks. All but the Chinese, who were already well acquainted with the full wrath of Japan's vicious determination to control them. But the rest of the world had largely ignored the fighting in China. Indeed, the Sino-Japanese War was often referred to as the Forgotten War because so few outsiders took any interest in it. After the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese troops in China became much more hostile towards foreigners, especially the British and Americans, who were now officially the enemy. Because of the changed attitudes towards foreigners, the London Missionary Society wanted all its missionaries together in one place. It asked Eric and 6 other men to leave the French concession and relocate into the English concession. Eric was invited to live with the Howard Smith family. He made the move to their home none too soon. Within days, electrified barricades were erected around the concessions, and Japanese soldiers manned all the gates in and out of them. The Japanese ordered all foreigners to remain inside the concession they were living in. There was to be no more moving about from concession to concession or into the city of Tientsin itself. Nor were there to be any more large meetings held. Any gathering of over 10 people was banned. This ban on meetings posed a challenge for Eric, who had been holding regular church services in the British concession. People from all walks of life, diplomats and textile mill owners, sea captains, teachers, and missionaries were living there. As the situation in China deteriorated, these people were beginning to worry about what the future might hold for them. They needed comfort and reassurance, and Eric held his regular church service as a way to provide them. And now, when these people needed even more comfort and reassurance in the face of increased Japanese hostility, Eric was being told that he could no longer hold his church services, at least not with more than 10 people present. Eric thought about the problem for a long time and finally came up with a solution. He decided to continue preparing a sermon each week, but instead of preaching the sermon from the pulpit, he wrote it out. Then he enlisted the help of another missionary's wife, who invited 9 people over for afternoon tea. While her guests sipped their tea, the missionary's wife handed out copies of Eric's sermon, and together they read and discussed it. Then each of those 9 people invited another 9 people to their home for afternoon tea and handed out copies of the sermon, which they read and discussed. Then each of those 9 did the same for another 9, and so it went on. In this way, it did not take long before everyone in the concession had heard the week's sermon, and all without breaking the Japanese order not to hold large public meetings. Eric's solution became known as the Afternoon Tea Church. Meanwhile, the Reverend and Mrs. Howard Smith loved having Eric stay with them. In 100-degree heat, Eric taught their daughters how to play tennis. He also played cricket with them and made up the 4th player if they wanted to play bridge. He showed the girls his stamp collection, and when they got excited about starting one of their own, he spent hours rolling up stamp albums for them. Nothing seemed too much trouble for him. When food supplies in the concession ran low and Mrs. Howard Smith had difficulty buying bread, Eric volunteered to get in line at the bakery at 5 o'clock every morning to make sure the family got some. In a letter to a friend, the Reverend Howard Smith wrote, "I never saw Eric angry. I never heard him say a cross or unkind word. He just went about doing good." By August 1942, Eric was beginning to think that his time in China was nearly over. He had finished the manual he'd been writing, and since he could not leave the British concession, he couldn't see much point in staying in China. The Japanese had promised that before 1942 had ended, they would grant permission to leave the concessions to anyone who wanted to return to his or her home country. Eric wrote to Flo and explained the situation. He wondered what she thought about the idea of his continuing his pastoral work in Canada. There was plenty of hard work to be done there, spreading the gospel message. Flo wrote back to tell him she thought it was a wonderful idea for him to come to Canada. She also told him that Patricia and Heather had both started school and that 10-month-old Maureen was growing and thriving. The letter lifted Eric's spirits. He could hardly wait to get to Canada and see his family again and begin a new life with them there. August dragged into September, and September into October. There were many rumors, but no firm word as to when the Japanese would allow foreigners to leave the concessions to return home. New Year's Day 1943 came and went, and still no news. There was no news until lunchtime, March 12th, 1943, but it was not the news Eric or anyone else had been expecting. All British and American enemies were to report to Wesen internment camp in the center of Shantung province 400 miles southeast of Tientsin. No enemies would be allowed to leave China to return to their home country. The foreign enemies were given 2 weeks to prepare for their internment. Each person was allowed to send 3 trunks and a bed and bedding ahead to the camp. As he loaded his bed onto a waiting Japanese truck, Eric wondered whether he would ever see it again, or whether it was just a Japanese ploy to steal beds for their troops. Those to be interned were also to be allowed to carry 2 pieces of luggage with them to the camp. The Japanese divided the people in the British concession into 3 groups and made Eric captain of one of the groups. The groups would be transported to the internment camp one at a time over 3 consecutive days. Eric's group was scheduled to leave on March 30th. As the day approached, Eric looked at his belongings and wondered what were the best things to take to an internment camp. What would it be like there? Should he prepare for a short stay or a long one? Which was more important, an extra set of clothes or a supply of canned meat? A kettle or a set of encyclopedias? Would he be housed in a dormitory or a cell? The more Eric considered it all, the more questions he had about what lay ahead for him and the other enemies of the Japanese.